Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between Russia and Ukraine, along with other wars and conflicts and the political situation here in the United States, which are all kind of linked together in some way, if you really look at it. So, right now, the Ukrainians are allegedly, desperately in need of infusions of cash, and secondly, weapon systems from the United States and other Western European powers. So I would say, first and foremost, for the Zelensky regime in Kiev, and you must call it a regime, as elections have been terminated in Ukraine over the issue of the war, the conflict. But Zelensky desperately needs cash. Cash to pay government employees, and more importantly, cash to continue to prop up his political situation. He needs that money. Now, in Congress, here in the United States, the Republicans are refusing to simply hand over $60 billion in cash to the Ukrainians. So why is that? Why are the Republicans hesitant about sending another $60 billion to Ukraine? I think it's reasonable to say at this point, we really don't know how much money, how much treasure, how many weapon systems have been handed over to the Ukrainians. We really don't know at this point. Maybe in the future we will, but right now we really don't know. Probably getting close to $200+ billion, if not more. Now, at the same time, this war is being fought in Eastern Europe. The unitary one-party state, known as the Democrat Party, again, the Democrat or Democratic Party is not a democratic institution, not any longer. Its goal right now is to persecute its political enemies through the use of states and the power of the federal government to destroy those enemies, either by putting them in prison or damaging them so severely economically they don't have the ability to pose a political threat to the unitary one-party state in the Democrat Party. Now, the goal of the Democrat Party or the unitary one-party state is to create a unitary one-party system, a one-party system of government that has the veneer of democracy. But in fact, it will not be a traditional democracy. It will not be a representative republic. Through the use of flooding the United States with illegal aliens from all over the world, millions upon millions of illegal aliens that will change congressional districts, that will damage local economies and create crisis, and war creates a one-party unitary system of government. Look at Ukraine. No more elections. Zelensky in total control of that country. It's ironic that the mainstream media here in the United States defines the leadership of Vladimir Putin as a dictatorship. Yet there was an election recently in the Russian Federation. Elections were canceled in Ukraine. Ukraine essentially has a one-party system of rule now. So again, war, conflict, crisis benefit the unitary one-party state. And that's what the Republicans here in the United States are concerned with. The overreaching power of the unitary one-party state that currently runs the White House. I mean, let's face it, Joseph Biden in the White House is not running the country. It is a cabal of left-wing radicals and corporocrats who are now running the United States. It's a fact. And that is why the last vestiges of the two-party system in the United States is preventing this $60 billion infusion of cash to Ukraine. Now, as we speak, within the last 24 hours, there has been a Russian large-scale cruise missile strike against targets in Kiev. It's the first time in about 6 weeks that the Russians have launched such a fairly large strike. Not the biggest, not the smallest, about 30 to 40 cruise missiles and a few ballistic missiles were launched against targets in and around Kiev. Now, the Ukrainians allegedly claim to have shot down all incoming cruise missiles. Yet the Ukrainians also claim that they really need that money. They really need more air defense systems from the United States. Now, in terms of the ongoing war, the Russians continue to pound away at the front lines, continue to weaken the Ukrainian military to the point of possible collapse. We continue to see the French posturing themselves for a possible intervention on behalf of the Ukrainians. Now, believe this. That posturing and that narrative coming from France, coming from Macron, is being authorized by powers that be in Western Europe and the United States. If things get really bad for the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainian military is on the precipice of collapse, this is how, through initially a French intervention, again under the guise of a humanitarian or training mission, would get the initial forces into Western Ukraine. And that's how the conflict would start. The United States nor Western Europe cannot just outright start to use forces overtly against Russian forces, obviously. But injecting French forces first in Western Ukraine, and in all likelihood, the Russians would, at some point, strike at those forces, either with intent or unintentionally, leading to French casualties. as I've said before, that narrative would then be spun that the Russians have attacked a NATO ally, France. Again, the uninformed urbanite here in the United States, most of them do not even know where the Ukraine is. Still, even with this conflict, many do not know where it is. And if the mainstream media starts announcing that Russia has attacked France and killed French soldiers, and the United States is now forced to intervene on behalf of its NATO ally, you would get a blank stare from the uninformed urbanite. Well, I guess we have to do something, don't we? They attacked NATO. They, the Russians. And this is how dangerous the situation is. Compounding that, the political situation in the United States is teeter-tottering on anarchy. The upcoming presidential elections, the continued persecution of the unitary one-party states' political enemies in the United States continues. And eventually there is going to be a reaction. There's going to be a reaction. And in all likelihood, that will coincide with the election processes here in the United States. Very concerning what's happening. Now, we continue to hear from the mainstream media that if the Ukraine falls, Western Europe is next. So what they're saying is if the Russians are able to defeat Ukraine, whether it is the complete movement of Russian forces into all of Ukraine and changing the government in Kiev, or the seizing and annexing large parts of eastern Ukraine, that Western European nation states will be next. Well, the only real Western European nation state, or nation states, that could reasonably be next in terms of a Russian military operation would be the Baltic states. Now look, the Baltic states is and are questionable in terms of being valid members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. An incredibly difficult and tenuous situation in terms of the ability of NATO to respond to a Russian attack on the Baltic states. Would it be worth World War III to fight the Russians in the Baltic states? You answer that question. You, the viewer. Now, outside of the Baltic states, the next target that is often talked about in the mainstream media is Poland, Romania, possibly Moldova. But is Poland a valid military target for the Russians? You have to look at the cost versus benefit. What would be the cost of a Russian military move against Poland, and what would be the benefit? Well, clearly, the cost would be much higher than any benefit of making a military move into Poland. So the likelihood that that threat is real and that threat is truthful is highly unlikely. Highly unlikely that the Russians would make a military move towards Poland. The Baltic states, again, given the situation that is now happening in Ukraine, I wouldn't take it off the table. But at the same time, that is NATO's strategic error for accepting the Baltic states into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was part of the Soviet Union. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Core states of the Soviet Union. Again, as I've talked about before, if we were to go back into the 70s, the 80s, early 80s, and make the claim that the Baltic states would become part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, much less Poland, there would have probably been a Third World War. The Soviet Union would probably have coalesced around that very issue of the prospects of the Baltic states joining NATO. It would just be something that was unfathomable at the time. You just couldn't comprehend it. But it's reality. Now, in terms of the United States, if the shoe was on the other foot and we were looking at some sort of Sino-Soviet Warsaw Pact alliance moving into border states around the United States, either Mexico, something would have happened in Canada, the fracture of Canada, and then we would see maybe parts of Canada becoming accepted into the Warsaw Pact. The United States would have never allowed that. The United States would have gone to war to prevent that from happening. So again, NATO has put itself in a position that quite possibly is untenable in the Baltic states and has unwittingly escalated the situation. Maybe not when it happened, because Russia was much weaker at that point in time, but not thinking about what the future would look like. They went ahead and pulled the trigger. And now there's going to be repercussions for pulling that trigger. Again, shoes on the other foot. If countries that bordered the United States were joining the Warsaw Pact or some other alliance that could threaten the United States would not allow that to happen. So why shield the Russians? It's a valid question. Wherever you sit, whatever side of the equation you fall upon, you have to ask that question. So again, this rhetoric about a Russian move into Western Europe is really nonsensical. Outside of the Baltic states, the cost versus benefit is just too great. So that narrative that you hear, well, if Ukraine falls, Western Europe is next, that is simply false. They're being untruthful. It's not going to happen. Not going to happen. So that's it for today. We will continue to watch the situation very closely on the ground. The war continues. The war is continuing to escalate. And I think at this point we can only hope for the best. Have a good day.